So is the idea of privatisation in the prison service flawed? Joined by campaign manager at the Taxpayers Alliance, James Price, and director of We Own It, Kat Hobbs. Hello to you both. Thank you for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. We've seen what's happened at Birmingham Jail. Let's speak a little bit more widely as well, should we? To you, Kat, first of all, privatisation, is it ever a good idea?
We think it's never a good idea, and that's what the British public think as a whole. Public ownership is incredibly popular, and that's because privatisation has failed again and again and again. G4S itself has had scandal after scandal, but this isn't just about G4S. We've seen rail fares go up again and again so that it's completely unaffordable. We've seen private companies leaking away our water because they just can't be bothered to invest. Privatisation is failing, and we saw that with Carillion collapsing. We're seeing that now with G4S having to be looked after by the government. What we see is that privatisation fails, the state has to step in, and the public has to pick up the pieces.
James?
No, I don't think privatisation has failed wherever it's been tried. I know a lot of us have forgotten what the UK looked like as far back as the 1970s, for example, where bodies were going unburied and you had roving power cuts and the three-day week and all these sorts of things from an overly large state that tried to do so many things, and it owned airlines, it owned travel agents, it owned bookies and all these sorts of things. And that went badly wrong. The 1980s brought waves of privatisation that allowed all kinds of innovation, huge amounts of investment, huge tax revenues that come from these things. Of course, these things can go wrong on occasion. That happens in a capitalist system, and no one's really defending what G4S has failed to do here. The good thing about this is that we can maybe get G4S out of this system for a while, and the government needs to be better at its procurement and its tendering skills so we can introduce more competition into the system. That means more investment, more expertise and more ideas to stop these things happening again. But fundamentally, we want more investment, more taxes coming from the expertise of private companies, and not keeping taxpayers on the hook all the time for these things, and not having the profit motive driving things to get better.
Yeah, James, I'm not really sure that bodies weren't being buried because of privatisation. I think it was more to do with the fact that it was the winter of discontent and the gravediggers were on strike. But there we go, that's another matter. If you'd like to answer the point, Kat, that James has been making there, it's not always a bad idea.
Yeah, I think we need to have investment in our public services, and what we saw in the 70s and the 80s was that we didn't have that investment. And so the government had a purposeful policy of undermining public services like British Rail to fatten them up and essentially pave the way for the private sector to come in and say, oh, now we can save the day. But the fact is that privatisation has now had 30 years plus to try and prove itself. And what we've seen is that costs are rising, both for individuals and for the public purse. We've seen quality go down, scandals like the scandal that's happening in the prison in Birmingham right now. And we've seen a huge loss of accountability. We, the public, pay for these services. We use them. We rely on them. And yet what's happening right now is that a handful of shareholders are benefiting at all of our expense. And when they decide they don't want to be involved in our public services anymore, we have to step in, because actually they're not really interested in providing a good public service. They're only interested in making money.
James?
I think it's a really pernicious idea to suggest that governments are trying to deliberately run down systems so that they can then sell them off and privatise them. I think that's completely ludicrous. I mean, we sometimes look at examples like Scandinavia and Sweden for examples where larger states can work. But in Sweden, they may have more tax and redistribution, but the government is a lot less meddlesome in some of these ways and allows the private sector in more ways. So in Sweden, they allow the profit motive to come in even to state schools. They have something like 3 times more of their healthcare is provided by private provision than we have in the UK. Privatisation allows, as I said before, for expertise and all these things to come in, huge amounts of investment, huge tax revenues that come in, and the idea that huge profits are being creamed off. Some people were talking about the collapse of Carillion as if it was huge profits. It's the fact they weren't making enough profit from these things. If you look at the rail fares increase from last week, profits in the rail sector are only about 2%, and you compare that to, again, all the investment that comes in, all the kind of expertise from the private sector, and not leaving taxpayers on the hook for these things. It's true that we have to pay for these services in some ways, but it's much more efficient to get business to come in and to help improve these things and make them more efficient. And if people want to invest in companies that do that and make a reasonable return, this idea that profit and business itself is some kind of evil, nasty thing is not something that most people will recognise. It's normally it's a healthy, natural, human thing to want to create something, grow it, and take a reasonable return from it.
Well, James is absolutely wrong that private companies are more efficient. There's lots of evidence that shows that they're not. And the fact is that we can actually run these services ourselves, and that will be much more efficient because then the money can be reinvested back into services. I think there's this right-wing idea that it's actually quite extreme that says we have to have a market in everything. Let's not have a mixed economy. Let's have a market in everything. Let's have a market in prisons. Let's have a market in hospitals. Let's have a market in schools. Let's have a market in the railway. These things are public services. They are often natural monopolies. That means there isn't meaningful consumer choice. You don't get to choose which train you get on or where your water comes from. And people recognise that. That's why public ownership is so incredibly popular, because people understand that there isn't a market. I mean, look at the prison that we're talking about today. You know, are people choosing to go to prison? No, government is trying to act as the consumer, and it just isn't working. There's all kinds of costs in the procurement exercise and in the fragmentation and inefficiency of trying to involve lots of private companies in an artificial market. And what we've seen in prisons is that actually there's only a handful of big players, so they cash in, and when it doesn't work, we pick up the pieces, as I've said. So, you know, let's stop pretending that we have a market in public services. We need a mixed economy. That means private companies are great at doing lots of things. Let's let them get on with that. Let them get on with boosting the economy and providing lots of goods. But why do we have to have everything being run by private companies when it's clearly not working?
I mean, the tax burden at the moment in the UK is at a 49-year high. I'm not sure that that's some kind of extreme, tiny government with companies reigning extreme in all these things. It's definitely true that it's harder to get the ideas of competition and the profit motive in when there are these sort of natural monopolies, whether it's water or rail or things like that. But of course, if you choose to take a train somewhere, the competition is between getting a bus or driving yourself there or hitching a lift or something like that. And we can also put in competition at the tendering stage. I've said that the UK is much worse at doing these things, at getting lots of other companies into the mix, maybe because taxes on businesses are very high at the moment, and that's stopping them investing and trying to get into these markets. We could do more and be more like the French and the Germans when it comes to these things. G4S is not necessarily a shining example of how these companies can do. They're so big and so cumbersome. They're actually representing in a way some of the inefficiencies that the state has when it tries to do these things.
Okay.
But this sure.
I mean, I think
I'm so sorry you started, I'm afraid, so we have to finish with James, but thank you both for joining us. We are out of time. Come back and talk to us again very soon. Good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.